The sound of boots on gravel cut through the quiet morning air, and before I even had time to wonder what was happening, I saw red and blue lights bouncing across the lake. The police cruiser pulled up fast, and the doors swung open to deputies, stepping out with hands on their weapons as if I was some kind of dangerous criminal. My heart pounded in disbelief, because this was the 5th time in 3 months they had stormed my cabin, all because of the color blue, the color I had painted. My own porch. It was almost laughable if it had not been so terrifying. And behind them she stood, Diana Peterson, the president of the Lake HOA, her silver hair catching the sunlight. Her lips curved in that same smirk that told me she thought she had finally won. I felt the weight of every stare, every judgment, as if the whole lake had turned against me. But deep down, I knew she had no idea what was coming, because what she believed was her triumph would soon be her downfall. I remember when I first found the cabin. After the pandemic, I needed change, I needed peace. Working as a freelance programmer meant I could live anywhere with decent internet. And this place by the water had been my dream for years. The cabin was small, built in, the 70s. But it had soul. It had the smell of old pine. And the way the sun danced on the lake felt like it was calling me home when I bought it. I thought I was buying freedom. What I didn't know was that I was also buying into a neighborhood. The first week was pure bliss. I set up my desk by the window overlooking the lake. I watched loons drift across the water while I coded. I felt like life had finally given me a break, and then I decided to repaint the porch. I wanted color. I wanted something bold. I chose cobalt blue, and as I whistled on that ladder brush in hand, a shadow crossed my work. A voice cut the air, sharp and cold. "Excuse me, that color has not been approved?" I turned to see her, Diana, tall and stiff, pressed like she had ironed her soul out of existence. Her arms crossed her lips, drawn into disapproval. She declared herself as president of the HOA, and she thrust a binder at me. A thick, heavy book of rules, 57 pages of restrictions. She said I needed to repaint, that the blue was garish, that it broke the harmony of the community. I remember holding that binder in my hands, flipping through pages, dictating mailbox design, grass length, even the type of flowers permitted, and I smiled because I knew something she did not. I told her politely that my property was not part of her HOA, that my deed and the boundary map both proved it. She tried to mask the fury in her face with a fake smile, but I could see it burning through her eyes. She said, "We will see about that," and walked away, dialing her phone before she even hit the road. Later that afternoon, I met Sarah, my neighbor. She was younger, a designer full of quiet warmth. She laughed when I mentioned Diana. "So you met the Dragon Lady." She told me stories of fines for wind chimes and recycling bins left out an hour too long. She warned me Diana would not stop. She had been trying for years to absorb the few properties outside her control. She would not forgive a blue porch, and she would not forgive me for standing outside her kingdom. The notices started the next morning, slipped under my door violation, unauthorized color selection repaint, within 7 days. I pinned it to my board with a laugh, thinking it was nothing. Then came 3 more, each more absurd than the last, unapproved landscaping excessive vehicle presence. When I had only 1 car parked in my own driveway, I was still laughing when the sheriff came that day. I watched through the window as Diana gestured, wildly pointing at my porch. The sheriff, tired and weathered, knocked at my door, and I let him in. I showed him my deed, my documents, and he nodded, said I was outside HOA jurisdiction, and he would tell Diana so. But I saw her face from the window. It turned a shade of green, and she argued with him like a child denied her favorite toy. That night, an old man with a cane walked up my drive. Herb Thompson, retired. Judge, lived here since before the HOA ever existed. He told me straight, "Son, you are up against more than a power trip." He explained that a developer wanted to buy the lake and that HOA board members stood to profit, but they needed every property, including mine. Suddenly, the blue porch was not just about paint. It was about money. Herb leaned close and said, "Document everything, because Diana does not play fair. His words settled heavy in me. From then on, it became clear the violation slips were not jokes. They were strategy, intimidation. Day after day, they piled up bird feeders. Trash bin colors absurd things designed to wear me down. And when the cease and desist letter arrived from Thomas Reed, the HOA attorney and conveniently Diana's cousin, the weight of their game pressed harder. It was no longer petty harassment. It was legal warfare. I spent hours at the county records office digging through dusty files proving what I already knew. The HOA had no claim over me. My property was always outside their reach. But it was not about truth to them, it was about power. Kept every letter, every notice, every absurd complaint, and I began to realize this was bigger than me. Neighbors had been bullied into selling at prices far below value boats. Mysteriously untied fences, mysteriously cut always after they refused. HOA offers the pattern was clear and the enemy was not just one woman. It was a system built to crush anyone who dared resist one evening. I sat on my porch watching the sunset, remembering when my father brought me here as a boy for fishing trips. And campfires I thought about how this lake was tied to memory, to family, to something deeper than paint and rules. I felt my resolve solidify like steel in my chest. This was not just my home. This was part of my life, and I would not let them take it. Everyone in town started whispering about me and the cabin on the North Shore. The one with the defiant blue porch neighbors who used to wave grew cold and silent. Sarah told me in a low voice that Diana had called an emergency meeting warning members that I was a disruptive influence, a threat to the harmony of the lake. She was pressuring everyone to avoid me. She said even talking to me could result in a fine. Her words shook me, because I realized this was not just harassment anymore. It was exile. The next day, I caught an HO board member crouched near my driveway, snapping photos of my car, when I asked her why she bolted like a thief. And that afternoon, a notice appeared, claiming my car was illegally parked on an HO access road, though it sat squarely on my property. The laughter that once met each notice had long vanished. Now I felt a chill every time I found one taped to my door. The game was turning darker. I called my father, who had practiced law for decades. He listened carefully to my frustration, then said, "Son, document everything, take photos, record conversations, keep a timeline, because what they are building against you is a false case, and the only way to beat it is to build a stronger case of truth." Against them, I heard the firmness in his voice, and I remembered the same man teaching me to cast a line on this lake, telling me never let a bully push you into the water. Stand your ground, or you will never forgive yourself. The harassment grew sharper. Someone reported me to the county for illegal waste disposal because I was composting leaves and soil legally. Another day, my internet mysteriously went down for 3 days, though no other homes lost service. Then my freelance business page was bombarded with 1-star reviews posted from local addresses. I recognized the pattern. The walls were closing in, and they were trying to choke me from every side. The letter that came next turned irritation into fury. Thomas Reed, the HOA, attorney cousin to Diana, sent me a formal litigation threat citing community standards and demanding compliance. He wrote with arrogance as if he held absolute power, but at the bottom of the letter he had signed with his bar admission year, and it hit me. He had a personal conflict of interest. He was using family ties to wage this war and never disclosed it. I held that letter in my hands, and I thought of my father's words. Bullies stop only when you hit back 10 times harder. So I buried myself in the county records office stacks of dusty folders, yellowed paper. Meeting minutes from decades ago, I found an old faded map with a faint pencil note. Historic overlay zone across the entire lake. I did not know what it meant yet, but I knew it mattered. I pulled more records boxes of them, digging through mildew and time, and I realized something. The original Lake Association from the 70s was nothing like this. HOA back then. Neighbors had gathered for cleanups, shared docks, and fish stocking. It was community, real community. not control somewhere over time. Collaboration had hardened into dictatorship, and Diana had turned it into her empire, an older woman at the records desk. Noticed my exhaustion and asked gently if I had found what I needed when I explained my battle. She whispered, "You need to look up the Wisconsin area. Freedom Act of 1983. Hardly anyone remembers it, but it prohibits HOAs from enforcing rules outside their registered boundaries," she printed. "The law for me." The words were clear and final. No HOA may impose aesthetic restrictions on non-member properties. I stared at that paper as though it were a shield forged just for me. I left that office with a new fire in me. I shared the law with the other 4 cabin owners outside the HOA, and we formed an alliance meeting quietly at Herb's place to avoid spies, a retired teacher, a doctor, and his wife, a young couple. We all knew the feeling of being hunted by Diana. Each had their own story. A bird bath called an unapproved water feature, a wind chime too loud, photos snapped from the bushes. The young couple confessed they had thought of selling just to escape. I told them we had power. Now we had the law and we had each other. But it seemed Diana had eyes everywhere. Within a day, the harassment doubled. A smear campaign erupted on the community social page, accusing me of running an illegal business from my home and tanking property. Values lies crafted with precision and spread like poison. Neighbors who barely knew me began to glare when they passed my driveway. I saw the triumph in Diana's eyes each time she watched me from across the road, recording every move on her phone she wanted me to crack. And then, Sheriff Donovan arrived again, his cruiser pulling up for the 3rd time in less than a month. This time the complaint was illegal, dumping supposedly toxic waste in my yard. I walked him to my garden and showed him the soil, the seedlings, the native flowers. "Does this look toxic, Sheriff?" He sighed, ran a hand over his tired face and whispered, "This is getting out of hand, Mason. I have real police work to do, but between us I am documenting these false calls. There could be consequences." After he left, I invited him inside. I showed him the law, the maps, the evidence I had collected. He looked at them with a raised brow and admitted he had never even heard of the statute, but he told me I might have a strong case if I kept gathering proof for the first time. I saw something shift in his eyes, a flicker of doubt about the woman he had been protecting for years. That evening, Herb visited again. Leaning on his cane, he told me about Diana's past, how she had been fired from a property management job years ago for creating a hostile work environment and abusing her authority. The HOA presidency was her redemption story. The only place she felt powerful, she would cling to it with claws and teeth. I listened and thought about what Sarah had told me, how she risked fines just to speak to me, how this fight was no longer just about me, but about everyone caught under Diana's reign. So I drafted my own cease and desist letter citing the Freedom Act, demanding that all enforcement against me stop. Immediately, I sent copies to the board, the attorney, the county office, every corner of their kingdom I struck, and the response came swift. Thomas wrote back, dismissing the law as obsolete and threatening costs of litigation. I studied his words, and I saw what he was hiding. Bluff, no citations, just threats. It was the move of someone afraid, and as the sun set on the lake that night, casting gold across the blue porch, I understood something. This was not just a battle for paint or rules. This was a battle for truth, a battle for dignity. And I was only just beginning. The night was restless. Storms rolled over the lake, lightning carved the sky, and thunder rattled the old glass in my windows. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how far Diana would go to break me by morning. I had my answer. Another cruiser. Another knock. Sheriff Donovan stood there again. Looking almost embarrassed, he said there had been a noise complaint, power tools, at odd hours disrupting the peace. I laughed bitterly. The only tool I had touched that day was a screwdriver to fix a loose chair leg for 15 minutes in the afternoon. I told him straight. "She is using you to harass me." He shifted uncomfortably, glanced back at Diana, filming from the road, and whispered, "Look, I know, but I have to respond to every call. Just be Careful, Mason, she has influence more than you realize. I could see it in his eyes, the weight of political strings pulling him. He was tired of being her pawn, but caught in her grip. Yet even his warning could not prepare me for what came next. The harassment turned into something darker, the kind that digs under your skin and festers. Anonymous reviews appeared online, destroying my business reputation with lies. Clients called me asking if I was running scams. I knew the reviews were local, and targeted my income was her new weapon. She wanted to starve me out. Then came a letter from Thomas Reed, threatening direct litigation again, his tone smug as if he were already the victor. But what struck me most was the arrogance. They no longer even cared to hide their tactics. They believed I would break Fold Cell and disappear like others before me, and for a moment I almost did. I sat on my porch staring at the water, remembering fishing trips with my father when I was a boy, his laughter, the way he taught me to skip stones, and I asked myself, was this home worth the endless battle? The answer came not from memory, but from the records office. Again, I had gone back desperate for any weapon I could find, and there buried, among permits and plans, was a proposal. A thick document labeled Meridian Development Group, dated just months before I had moved in. As I read the pages, my pulse quickened. It was a full resort plan. 200 rooms, a golf course, boat rentals, restaurants, and detailed compensation structures for HOA board members, a $25,000 bonus for each one who secured property sales double for the president herself. It all made sense at last. Diana was not just obsessed with rules or power. She was chasing a payday, and my refusal threatened millions. I copied every page, tucked it away, and brought it to Herb that evening. His old hands trembled as he turned the documents over. "Son, this is fraud. Plain and simple." He said. "They are conspiring to sell out the whole lake without the community's consent." I saw firelight in his eyes, the kind of fire that had probably carried him through decades on the bench. He told me we had something real. Now, something no judge would ignore. I shared the evidence with the other 4 non-HOA neighbors. Their faces told the story. Relief, fear, anger, all at once. The retired teacher spoke. First, they offered to buy my place for 20% below market when I refused the harassment. Doubled the. Doctor nodded. They tried the same with us. But we held on. We knew something was off now. We all understood exactly why and exactly what was at stake together. We decided to stand firm, to resist. It did not take long for the counter-strike. Diana and Thomas appeared at my cabin in person, marching up the drive with fury in their steps. She told me coldly, "You will comply one way or another." Thomas added threats of endless litigation, of financial ruin. I recorded it all, my phone in clear view. Asked them plainly, "Is this a threat? Because it sounds like you are using frivolous lawsuits to force me into rules that do not apply to me." Diana's composure cracked. She snapped people who cross me. "Do not last long," I replied evenly. "Sheriff Donovan might like to hear that statement." She turned crimson and stormed off, her power faltering under the weight of her own words. Not an hour later, Donovan's cruiser arrived again. This time the call was that I had threatened HOA officials. I played him. The recording he watched, silently, jaw tight, and for the first time his loyalty shifted. He turned to Diana, standing in the road, and told her firmly, "This is harassment, and it stops." Now I saw the fury in her eyes, but I also saw fear. The mask of control was slipping. Yet even as Donovan warned her, even as neighbors began whispering doubts, I felt the pressure pressing on me. Sleepless nights, collapsing business isolation like a cage closing. In one evening, I called my father desperate. I told him I was ready to sell, ready to walk away. He listened, then asked, "Do you remember the day you caught that big bass on this lake? You were only 8 years old. It was almost dark. Everyone else had given up, but you refused to quit. You fought that fish until you landed it, because you knew it mattered. You knew it was worth it. Son, this cabin, this lake is your fish now, and you cannot give up." I sat in silence, tears burning my eyes, and I knew he was right. Some battles are worth breaking yourself over, because if you walk away, you lose more than a home. You lose who you are. That night, a message appeared on my phone unsigned except for 3 words. A concerned citizen. It said, "Diana falsified the HOA boundary documents. I have proof. Meet me tomorrow at the county clerk's office." My pulse raced. My hands shook because at last I had the missing piece. Someone on the inside had turned, but before morning came, the storm rolled in a furious storm that tore shingles from my roof and sent water dripping into my bedroom. I climbed up with tarps in the rain, cursing fate, but also feeling something strange. A test, maybe, because as I worked, neighbors began to appear not HOA loyalists, but ordinary people who brought coffee sandwiches, extra tarps. They worked beside me, silently fixing what nature had broken and what Diana wished to see destroyed. This was the real community, unshackled by her rule, but she could not stand to see it. Word spread fast, and within hours she convened her board and declared a storm recovery ordinance, granting HOA authority over all lakefront properties, even those outside its jurisdiction, under the excuse of emergency safety. She filed documents twisting vague municipal codes into weapons. It was a new level of overreach, and soon I held a summons in my hands. The HOA was suing me to stop my repairs, claiming emergency jurisdiction with falsified maps. I looked at that paper and whispered to myself, "This is the line they have crossed too far, and now they will pay." The knock at my door came heavy this time. The kind that tells you trouble is standing on the other side. Sheriff Donovan stood there holding a folded paper in his hand, his face lined with something between duty and regret. He said he was ordered to serve me with an injunction the HOA was demanding. I stop all roof repairs immediately under emergency safety protocols. I looked past him, and there she was. Again. Diana standing across the street, arms crossed, smile sharp as glass. She called, "Out. I told you that you could not win." I felt anger rise in my chest, but instead of shouting, I smiled calmly because I had been preparing for this moment. I invited Donovan inside and placed a thick folder of documents on the table. I told him, wanted to file formal charges. The folder held everything. The original boundary maps, Patricia's sworn statement that she had witnessed Diana and Thomas altering the documents, dozens of violation slips, photographs, dates, conversations, every piece of harassment stacked one on top of the other like bricks in a wall. Donovan leafed through the papers, and his eyes grew darker by the second. If this is true, he said, this is serious. I told him it was all true, and that I had more evidence of a resort development scheme that showed personal profit for the HOA board. When he saw the commission fees circled in red, his jaw tightened. "You realize," he whispered, "this is fraud on a county-wide scale." By the next day, I had filed a countersuit against the HOA, against Diana, against Thomas for harassment, fraud, and abuse of process. The news spread through the lake community faster than fire through dry grass. Members who had once cowered began to question her leadership. Sarah organized a petition, demanding transparency. Half the HOA signed it, and for the first time, Diana's control began to crumble. The morning of court was one I will never forget. The county courthouse was packed, every HOA member, every non-HOA neighbor, even locals and reporters. Curious about the story, I walked in, wearing my best suit, carrying my portfolio of evidence. My heart pounded, but my resolve was steel across the aisle. Diana strutted in, flanked by Thomas and 2 other attorneys, her expression smug as if she were untouchable. Thomas smirked openly when he saw me representing myself. He leaned toward another lawyer and said loud enough for me to hear a programmer playing lawyer, "This should be entertaining." The judge was Eleanor Watkins, a veteran with 30 years on the bench. She took one look over her glasses and silence fell. She announced, "We had 2 issues to address: the HOA motion for injunction and my countersuit." She ordered Thomas to begin. He rose, adjusting his expensive tie, and spun his tail. of emergency safety, of structural integrity, of community standards. He presented a map showing my cabin inside HOA boundaries as if it had always been there. The judge asked pointedly about the boundaries, and he smiled smugly, saying my property had long been considered part of the functional community. Then it was my turn. I walked to the front of the court and presented certified copies of the original boundary maps filed in 1995, clear as day, showing my cabin outside there. Reach. Then I laid the Freedom Act on the table, the law that explicitly prohibited enforcement on non-member properties. The judge studied it carefully, her expression unreadable, then turned to Thomas and asked Counselor, "How do you explain the discrepancy between these maps?" He stumbled words, fumbling about development integration patterns, about functional community. The judge replied dryly, "HOA boundaries are legal, not functional. They do not shift without formal amendments and unanimous consent of affected parties." I began to present the stack of harassment evidence, the absurd violation notices, the police reports, sworn testimony from neighbors, Sheriff Donovan himself, confirming the repeated baseless calls, and then I dropped the final. Wait. The resort plan documents detailing the board's payout. Upon acquisition of every property, gasps rippled through the courtroom. HOA members turned to look at Diana with shock and betrayal written on their faces. Thomas sprang up, objecting, calling it irrelevant, but the judge overruled him. Then came his desperate move. He produced a paper claiming it bore my signature, agreeing to abide by HOA rules upon purchase. Murmurs swept the room. He handed it to the bailiff, and it reached me. I studied it for a moment, then smiled. "This is forgery." I told the judge I had commissioned a handwriting analysis in advance. Anticipating this tactic, I presented it along with genuine examples of my signature, and then I called Patricia to the stand. Her voice shook, but her words were firm. She told the court she had watched Diana and Thomas doctor the boundary documents before submitting them. She said they literally used Photoshop to move the lines. The judge turned her gaze on Thomas, cold as winter counselor. "I hope you did not learn this in law school." Herb testified next about the history of the lake, how the 5 cabins on the North Shore had always stood apart from the HOA. Sarah testified about Diana's control and intimidation. Other members stepped forward one by one, painting a portrait of tyranny. Finally, Diana took the stand under questioning. She dodged, twisted, avoided, but 20 minutes and her facade cracked. She snapped, "The HOA is the only place I ever felt valued. Since I was fired, I built it into something powerful, and I will not let 5 stubborn holdouts ruin everything, even if it means breaking the law." The courtroom fell silent, and the judge leaned forward, saying, "That is all I need to hear." Her verdict was swift. She dissolved the injunction ruled in my favor, barred the HOA permanently from enforcing any rule on non-member properties, and referred the matter of document fraud to the district attorney's office for criminal investigation. She turned to Thomas and said, "You should prepare for a conversation with the Bar Association." His face drained of color. Diana stormed from the courtroom, her empire crumbling behind her. When it was over, HOA members came to me apologizing, ashamed that they had followed blindly. Some hugged me, some shook my hand, others admitted they had no idea about the resort plan. They realized they had almost lost everything to greed and lies. I left the courthouse with relief, heavy, but also with something more, because in the stack of documents I had reviewed during discovery, I had found one last piece, something overlooked, something older, something that could change everything for good. It was a faint notation on a faded map, historic overlay zone, words that would soon bring the final collapse of Diana's world. When I first traced my finger across those faint penciled words, historic overlay zone, I did not yet understand the power they carried, but something inside me told me not to ignore it. So after the trial, I dove headfirst into the archives again. Crawling through boxes of yellowed paper that smelled of mildew, flipping through binders of ordinances and minutes from meetings forgotten by time, and what I uncovered left me stunned. In 1968, the entire lake had been designated a Wisconsin Historic Preservation District. It was not just a lake. It was protected land with ecological features and historic cabins that could not be altered without state approval, and that meant no resort, no large-scale commercial projects, no sweeping HOA powers. It meant my cabin and the others were untouchable. I gathered every scrap of documentation and brought it to Judge Watkins and the county planning office. The reaction was immediate, like a fuse sparking through dry wood. Resort proposal was dead on arrival. Every glossy rendering, every promise of profit crushed under the weight of preservation law. The HOA itself was shackled, permanently restricted to minor aesthetic issues, and even those had to comply with preservation standards. The monster that Diana had built for 15 years collapsed almost overnight. The fallout was swift. HOA members, furious at her betrayal, called for a vote of no confidence, and within days she was forced to resign. Thomas faced an ethics investigation for his role in falsifying documents. Whispers spread that suspension or even disbarment was looming. The HOA was ordered to pay damages to me and the other non-HOA cabin owners for harassment. The county began investigating how Diana had convinced officials to grant emergency powers during the storm. Her influence was evaporating like mist under sunlight. And Diana herself, the once imperious queen of the lake, stripped of her throne, forced to sell her beloved cabin to cover legal bills, moved into an aging mobile home park outside town. It was Sarah who told me she sometimes saw her in the grocery store, shrunken shoulders, no trace of triumph left, and the irony was sharp because Sarah herself had been elected the new HOA, president chosen on a platform of respect and transparency. She rewrote the bylaws to emphasize cooperation instead of control. Out of the ashes rose something new. The Lake Pinerist Preservation Alliance, a group that included HOA and non-HOA residents, working side by side to protect the natural beauty and history of the lake. It was the community Herb had spoken about, the kind that once stocked fish and cleaned docks, the kind Diana could never control. For me, life finally began to breathe again. I finished the repairs on my roof, this time under preservation guidelines, which ironically matched the original design from the 70s. My cobalt blue porch remained proudly, though I softened it with wood accents that honored the history of the place. Neighbors who had once avoided me now stopped by for coffee conversations. Children laughed on the docks again. The air felt lighter. Free or summer arrived, and with it, I decided to host a barbecue by the lake. I invited everyone, HOA members, non-members, even those who had once stood behind Diana. I wanted reconciliation. I wanted healing. And that evening, as smoke curled from the grill and the sun dipped golden over the water, I saw people laughing together for the first time in months. Sheriff Donovan came too, no longer on official business. But as a neighbor, he shook my hand firmly and offered an apology. He admitted he should have questioned the complaints more carefully from the beginning. Sometimes, he said, doing the right thing means questioning authority, even when it is uncomfortable. His words stayed with me and sparked an idea. I began to write a handbook, a guide for homeowners across the state explaining their rights against HOA overreach. I filled it with the lessons I had learned, the laws I had uncovered, the strategies for fighting back. I posted it online free for anyone who needed it. And to my surprise, messages began pouring in from strangers around the state, people battling their own versions of Diana, people desperate for hope. One evening, as I sat on my blue porch looking out over the calm water, I spotted a car moving slowly along the road. It was her Diana. She drove past, her posture slumped, her power gone. For a moment, I almost felt pity. I raised my hand in a small wave, and though she did not return it, I later sent her a copy of my handbook with a simple note. Everyone deserves to understand their rights, because deep down I knew the truth. She had lost everything, not because of me, but because of her choices, her greed, her hunger for control. The handbook spread further than I ever expected. Homeowners from across the country wrote to me, thanking me for shining a light on their struggles. Some even suggested I follow my father's path and study law to fight these battles full time, and for the first time I considered it. Maybe that was the purpose behind all the pain, to transform it into a shield for others. Lake Pinerist became an example, a story people pointed to when they asked, can a community survive without control? The answer was yes, stronger than before. The preservation status ensured it would never become just another overcrowded resort. It would remain what it was meant to be, a refuge, a place where the sound of loons at dusk carried over calm water and where memories could be built generation after generation in the end. I realized this fight had never really been about a blue porch. It had never really been about bylaws or fines. It had been about standing up to bullies. It had been about dignity, about refusing to let greed erase something meaningful. My father had taught me to fight for what matters. And as the sun set that evening, painting the water gold, I finally understood that some places, some battles, some moments are worth every sleepless night, every confrontation, every storm, because in protecting them, you protect yourself. The courthouse victory should have been the end, but battles like these never truly end overnight, because wounds in a community run deep, and trust once broken takes time to mend. I woke each morning with the weight of months of harassment still pressing on my chest, waiting for the next knock, the next letter, the next false accusation. Even though the judge had spoken, even though the law was on my side, habit had trained me to expect war, and it took time before peace began to feel real. Neighbors, who once avoided me, started crossing the road to say hello. Tentative at first, a wave, a nod, then longer. Conversations, one older man confessed he had believed Diana's lies about me running an illegal business. He said he had even filed a complaint, out of fear of fines, and for that, he apologized, tears in his eyes. Another neighbor brought over a pie, saying she wished she had stood up sooner, that maybe if more people had spoken against Diana earlier, none of this would have dragged on so long. Their words healed something inside me. Slowly, Sarah settled into her new role as president. But unlike Diana, she held open meetings under the trees by the lake. Anyone could attend, HOA members or not, discussions about docks, fishing permits, garbage, collection. They felt like neighbors again instead of subjects under a throne. She asked for my help drafting new bylaws, ones that could never again be twisted into weapons, and together with Herb and other volunteers, we built a framework rooted in transparency, cooperation, and the preservation rules that now protected the lake forever. But rebuilding the community did not erase the scars. Some people still carried fear of retaliation. Some still flinched when a car slowed in front of their house. The memory of endless violation slips lingered like ghosts. And I realized that what Diana had done went beyond legal lines. She had stolen peace of mind from everyone around her, even those she once claimed to protect. I thought often about Donovan the sheriff, who had stood between loyalty to politics and duty to truth after the trial. He came by one evening not as an officer but as a friend. He admitted he had been pressured by county officials to take Diana's calls seriously because of her campaign donations. He said he regretted every knock he had made on my door, but I told him the truth. He had been the one to finally stand his ground in front of her. He had turned the tide, and I respected him for it. Sometimes courage is not about never bowing, it is about choosing the right moment to rise. My handbook continued to spread further than I imagined. Emails from strangers poured in stories of small HOAs acting like kingdoms in Texas, Florida, California. People grateful to learn that they had rights too. I began to wonder if maybe my father's path was calling me. Maybe law was not just a career, but a legacy. Maybe the fight had chosen me for a reason. Then one evening, Herb came by carrying an old photo album. He sat on my porch and showed me black and white pictures of the lake in the 70s, kids running along the docks, cabins, half-finished men hauling nets of fish, women laughing around campfires. He told me back then the lake was alive with friendship. People cared for each other without committees, without fines, without threats. And as he turned the pages, I saw my own childhood in those images, echoes of fishing trips with my father, laughter around flames, the same spirit that Diana had tried to erase and failed. There was still bitterness, though, because while Diana had lost her position and her property, she still lingered around town, her presence a reminder of what we had endured. Sometimes I would see her in the grocery store shoulders, slumped voice, quieter than I remembered. She would not meet my eyes. But I could feel the weight of her fall in the silence around her. Some said she was trying to start over. Others said she sat alone most nights staring at old photos of the lake. She had once ruled I could not bring myself to hate her anymore, because I saw what she had become, a hollow echo of the power she once wielded, and yet I also knew I could not let sympathy erase what she had done, because people had suffered, people had lost money, homes, dignity, peace because of her control. Sometimes justice looks like punishment. Sometimes it looks like truth revealed, and sometimes it looks like watching the one who once stood above everyone else sit alone in her own silence life. By the lake grew gentler. The seasons turned the leaves, shifting crimson and gold, the loons calling at dusk, the waves lapping against the shore. I found myself waking early just to watch the sun break across the water, grateful to feel peace in the place that had nearly been taken from me. I realized then that victory is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet. It is waking to stillness, without fear of flashing lights or pounding fists. It is hearing laughter where once there was suspicion. It is knowing that truth had held firm against lies. I thought again of my father telling me never to let a bully push me into the water, and I smiled because I had not only resisted, I had built something new out of the struggle, something that would protect others long after I was gone. Sometimes I wondered if peace could really last, or if it was just the calm before another storm, because people like Diana rarely let go completely, and the scars she left on this lake ran deep. There were days when I would catch myself staring out at the water, half expecting the flash of red and blue lights again, half expecting the crunch of boots on gravel. But the knock never came. The silence stretched, and I began to believe maybe, just maybe, the fight was finally over. Still, reminders of what had happened showed up in small ways. An anonymous letter slid under a door accusing me of ruining property values. A rumor spread in town that I had faked documents to win my case, but they never stuck because the truth was already out. The county investigation confirmed the boundary maps had been falsified, confirmed the resort plans were real, confirmed the board had betrayed its own members, and with every official statement, trust in the new leadership grew. Sarah thrived as president. She held community cleanups, invited the non-HOA cabins to participate, not as outsiders, but as neighbors. She listened when people spoke, and for the first time in years, laughter returned to the lakeshore. Even those who had once supported Diana came around, humbled but willing to rebuild. I saw it in their faces. They wanted forgiveness, and slowly the walls between us crumbled. I spent my days coding by the window again, watching the loons glide across the lake, but now I also spent evenings with neighbors, sharing meals around fires, telling stories, building what had been lost in those long months of fear. One night, the retired teacher raised a glass and said, "This is the first time in years I feel like I actually live in a community again." And his words hit me hard, because I realized that was what the fight had always been about. The handbook I had written began to take on a life of its own. More homeowners reached out, desperate for guidance. Some wanted legal advice. Others just wanted to know they were not alone. I answered as many as I could, sending them copies free, telling them what I had learned. And every time I hit send, I felt a quiet pride, not for winning against Diana, but for helping someone else stand taller. And then one afternoon I saw her again, not in a courtroom, not at the lake, but in town. She was sitting alone at a diner booth, her hair unstyled, her shoulders heavy. She looked like a shadow of the woman who once marched my driveway with arrogance. She did not see me. And for a moment, I just watched, wondering how it must feel to have built an empire of control only to see it crumble into dust. I wanted to hate her, but instead I felt something closer to sorrow, because power had been her entire identity, and without it, she was lost. Herb told me later that some board members were still under investigation, that Thomas faced possible suspension from the bar, that Diana had been forced to sell off personal belongings to cover her legal debts. Justice was slow, but it was steady. like the water wearing down stone, and in that patience there was a kind of peace, knowing the truth had already done its work as autumn deepened. I found myself walking the trails around the lake, more often breathing, in the crisp air, watching the leaves fall like embers around me. Sometimes I thought about the battles, the police visits, the sleepless nights, and I realized how close I had come to giving up, how easy it would have been to sell walk away and never look back. But then I thought of my father, his voice telling me some things are worth fighting for, and I knew this was one of them. One evening, as the sky burned orange and the lake reflected it like glass, I sat on my porch and felt the weight of everything lift. For the first time in months, I felt free. Truly free, because freedom is not just about property lines or laws. It is about dignity, about refusing to bend when bending would mean breaking yourself. And I knew that whatever came next, I would always carry that lesson with me. Neighbors stopped by more often now, sometimes just to talk, sometimes to bring food, sometimes to sit quietly and watch the sunset with me. It was the kind of simple connection Diana could never manufacture. Through rules or fines, it was real. It was human. And it was what made the lake feel alive again. And in those quiet moments, I began to think about the future. Maybe law school, maybe advocacy, maybe dedicating myself to helping others fight back against their own battles. Because if I had learned anything, it was that bullies exist everywhere. But so does resilience, so does truth. So does the stubborn will to stand up when everyone tells you to sit down. As the season turned and the air grew colder, I stood at the edge of the water skipping stones, just as I had when I was a boy. The ripples spread wide across the lake, and I realized that is what this story had become. Not just a fight, not just a victory, but a ripple spreading outward, touching lives I would never meet, giving courage to people who might otherwise feel alone. Winter came to the lake quietly, snow settling over the cabins, ice creeping along the shoreline, and for the first time in years, the silence was not heavy with suspicion, but peaceful neighbors strung lights across porches. Children laughed as they built snowmen. Even the old docks creaked with a kind of relief, as if the lake itself could breathe again. I sat on my blue porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the world turn white, and thought about everything we had endured. The police lights, the threats, the courtrooms, the storms, and how somehow through it all the truth had held. The historic designation became more than just a legal shield. It became a promise, a guarantee that the lake would never be paved over, never drowned in concrete. And resorts, it would remain what it had always been, a sanctuary for families, for memories, for people who sought stillness in a world that never slowed down. Herb said it best when he told me, "Son, this lake has outlasted every storm and every tyrant, and it will outlast us too." And I believed him because I had seen it. I had felt it. Diana's shadow lingered sometimes, a passing car, a hushed rumor at the market, a glimpse of her alone in town. But she no longer carried power. She no longer commanded. Fear she had become a reminder of what happens when control consumes someone, until there is nothing left inside them. She had wanted to be remembered as the woman who ruled the lake. Instead, she became the cautionary tale whispered about over coffee, and Firelight Sarah led the HOA into something unrecognizable from what it had been. She opened the books, she invited transparency. She turned what was once a kingdom into a gathering of equals. And when she asked me to sit with her during meetings, even though I was not a member, I saw the change firsthand. People spoke without fear. They laughed, they argued, but it was honest, and for the first time the word community meant something again. I finished my repairs under preservation guidelines. The roof sealed tight, the porch proud and blue neighbors helped me with final touches, not because a rule book demanded it, but because they wanted to, because that is what people do when fear is gone. I invited everyone for a lakeside gathering that spring, a feast of food and music and stories. Sheriff Donovan came too, not with papers, not with orders, but with a smile, and he raised a glass to doing the right thing. Even when it is hard, his words rang deep in my heart. And still the handbook I had written spread like ripples across the state, across the country. Strangers wrote to me, telling me they had faced their own Dianas, their own battles, their own storms, and that my story gave them courage to stand tall. Some asked for guidance. Some just wrote to say thank you, and each message reminded me that my struggle had not been wasted, that out of the sleepless nights and the fear had come something bigger than me on evening. I sat by the fire flipping through the handbook I had, printed the first copy, worn now by use, and notes scribbled in the margins. I thought about my father, his voice teaching me to stand firm, teaching me that dignity matters more than comfort. I thought about law school, about turning this into a calling. Maybe that was my next path. Maybe that was how I could honor what I had learned here. Maybe that was the ripple stretching wider still. The lake became what it was always meant to be. Families, fishing, children, learning to swim, neighbors, gathering, around fires, not because they were forced to, but because they wanted to. Because true community is never built through fear. It is built through choice and trust and love. I watched it unfold day after day and felt pride not in myself alone, but in all of us who had refused to surrender. Sometimes at dusk, I would see Diana's old cabin, now owned by a young family, kids playing on the dock, their laughter echoing across the water, and I wondered if she ever drove past and saw what she had. Lost if she realized that control had slipped through her fingers the moment she chose fear over trust, the moment she chose power over people, and I hoped in some way she learned the lesson too, because every person deserves the chance to change, even if they have fallen. The battle had been long, it had cost me sleep and peace, and almost my spirit. But standing there watching the sunset, paint the snow-tipped trees in gold, I knew it had been worth it, because sometimes the greatest victories are not the loud ones. They are the quiet ones, the ones where you can finally sit without fear, where you can look around and know that you protected something meaningful and that it will remain safe long after you are gone. And so I sit on my blue porch listening to the loons call across the lake, remembering the boy who once stood here with his father rod in hand, heart full of wonder, and I whisper to him, we did it. We protected what mattered. We stood against the storm, and we did not break. Because sometimes the only way to build a true community is to fight for it even when the odds are against you, even when the lights flash 5 times outside your door, even when the bully believes she has already won, and as the last light fades. Across the water, I know the truth. The battle was never just about paint. It was about dignity, about family, about the courage to stand your ground, and in the end, that is what truly lasts. You've heard this confession. Now wait until you hear the next one.